Professor Carrington, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here and to be part of this with you, with the good work that Constituting America is doing, and such a good discipline that you're all starting to look at the text of the Constitution, especially the original articles. We talk so much about how people talk about the Constitution, especially the courts, and talk so much often about the amendments to the Constitution, but there's a rich and important array of provisions in those original 7 articles, especially Article 1, that I think we can get a lot out of. So what I'd like to do before we get into the discussion is a quick overview of what's actually in it that I think will hopefully then bring about some good questions and conversation later. And I want to begin at the beginning. If Aubrey, if you could pull up Article 1, Section 1, the very beginning. It says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Pretty short beginning, but a very important one. And I think what to bring out is that it does 2 things. It gives a power to an institution, and it creates that institution at the same time, the institution of Congress. And in giving the power, it assumes that this power, called legislative power, already exists. And so one question to ask is, where does that power come from, if not from the Constitution? The Constitution seems to be assuming it and then delegating it. Well, consider the preamble that comes right before it. It existed before in We the People, how the preamble itself opens. And the people, through the Constitution, delegate it to Congress as the document establishes it. And this also therefore assumes, by the fact that it's called legislative power, I think a point to know ahead of time is that it assumes that all power is not alike, that you don't just have this big blob called political power, you have legislative power as well as other types, namely executive and judicial, that the other branches will bring up. And so that means that for us to really understand Article 1, we first have to ask, what is legislative power? What is this power that it's giving to this institution, Congress, that it's creating? And simply, it's the power to make laws, but you have to think about what laws are. Laws are the way that we bind a political community to do or abstain from certain actions, and that we do it by threatening punishment or giving reward for whether you keep the law or whether you don't. And that's going to be important, because one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation that preceded the Constitution was that it didn't have any way to punish or reward. And without coercion, we don't really have laws, we have advice, and government needs laws. So this is important that we have a legislative power that does these things, because our community is based on what's called the rule of law. There are other ways for rule to operate, namely human beings just doing whatever they want because they're in charge. But the framers of our Constitution said that's not the way we want to operate. They believed that the most just way to act was to create laws and then bind themselves and everyone else to follow them. So that makes the legislative branch really important, and I think is one reason why you can say Article 1 came first in the order of the articles, because every other power, executive and judicial, is based off of legislative. Executive enforces the laws. Judicial adjudicates and interprets the laws. Well, guess what? That means the laws have to exist. And that's the legislative branch's job. And why it's placed first is because its job is necessary for the rest of government to operate according to the rule of law. And so the next question that Article 1 brings up is, well, what is Congress then? And notice that Congress is created in light of the power that it's given. That means Congress is made for the purpose of making laws. And therefore, we have to think of Congress and about how it's put together with the idea of how does that enhance lawmaking? How is it made to do the best job possible of legislating? And the main quality, if you read things like the Federalist Papers that keep coming up, is that they wanted one quality above all others to dominate Congress, and that is deliberation, the ability to deliberate. And the idea was, if they can deliberate well together, they can make good laws, laws that work well, laws that are more just, and therefore we want to set up the institution to do that. And that's really the burden of sections 2 through 7 of Article 1. How does it set up a House and Senate, a Congress as a whole that is good at deliberating? And one is that it's plural. There's not just one lawmaker, as there were in some other countries in the history of the world. And by them being plural, by having more than one chamber, a House and Senate, and by having more than one person in each chamber, they're forced to talk to each other. They're forced, therefore, to deliberate. And what does that deliberation do? It refines, it corrects, it enhances the ideas for laws that may have not been as good if one person made them. And if you look, it's not just that there's more than one person, but it's that the House and Senate are composed in different ways. If you go through those sections, they originally were elected different ways, although that's changed because of the 17th Amendment. We could talk a little bit about that later. The qualifications for eligibility are different. The criteria you have to meet of age or how long you've been a citizen or other things is different between the House and Senate. The length of term is different, 2 versus 6 years. The number of persons in each chamber, the Senate's much smaller than the House and always has been. And also the fact that they're just all from different parts of the country. And what this does is this creates a lot of different perspectives and priorities based on the differences between members and the differences between chambers that all must be accounted for in passing laws. And therefore, think about, for example, trying to decide how to deal with scarce energy resources. Some persons might be attuned to the environmental concerns of energy, others to the business interests, still others to health concerns. And the idea of Congress is that you bring them all together to refine what would be the best laws that would take into account all of those things. And that's, by the way, why you have things like committees that focus on certain parts of policy making. You have an energy committee, you have an education committee, all these that are trying to focus in on a certain part of how to make laws better. And if you put those together, hopefully that creates the kind of deliberation that the founders, the framers hoped would make laws better. But then you got to ask, if you say that's the structure, we're going to deliberate well, what is it exactly they legislate about? And that's what Section 8 does. Section 8 is a list of powers. It says all powers herein granted are given to Congress. And it's important because obviously these powers are going to be the basis for what government does in general, what the executive executes and what the judiciary interprets and applies. And I'm not going to go through all the powers. There's a long list, but some of the important ones historically and ones that I think are still currently of note include the power to lay and collect taxes, a power that the national government did not have effectively under the Articles of Confederation and needed to run it. The power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. That's important because it's hard to not see how much of our lives are dominated by economic transactions. So who gets to regulate that is a big deal. The power to declare war, even though Congress hasn't formally done that in a while, and we can talk about why that might be the case. And also the very end of Section 8, which says that that Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out the listed powers above, which recognizes that we can't name every means that the national government might need to its limited ends. And so there's always been debates about that as well, going all the way back to the Washington administration. How far does that power go? But what it tries to do is set up all the powers that it hopes the national government will need to make laws that will be effective to do what we want the national government to do. Then I'll just briefly mention there's 2 more sections, sections 9 and 10. Section 9 is a limitation on the national government that pairs well with 8. 8 said what Congress can do. Section 9 says what the national government, or Congress in particular, cannot do, recognizing that there needs to be both giving of power and limiting of power for government to work effectively. And Article 10 is limitations on the state's legislative power. And I think that's there because you want to recognize that Congress isn't the only legislative body in our system. Our system is built on federalism, the idea that the states operate as well as the national government, so that there are powers and limits that are given to them as well. And that concludes the basic outline of Article 1. So we've run through it quick, but hopefully you can see how it all fits together coming out of the granting of legislative power. And I'll just say in conclusion that I think there's much wisdom to this design that we can talk about. There's a reason that it's lasted, but there's also much question about how well Congress operates now according to that design. There's been different eras where they've legislated more or less, where they've had more oversight over the executive versus and the bureaucracy versus less, where the Speaker of the House has been more important, or committee chairs have been more important, or the party, which is really the dominant factor now, the political parties have been very dominant. And so those different eras and the different powers just make it all the more important that we have the conversation we're having today, and that we return to this source, Article 1, to know it as citizens and as voters of this great republic. So thank you very much. I hope that gets a basis for us to then go forward with a good conversation about this text.
Well, thank you. That was a wonderful walkthrough that you just gave us. And I love how you started with the fact that we, the people, grant the power to the legislative branch. And that's just so important to remember. I know that we've got a lot of questions ready for you today with our student panelists. So I'm going to turn it over to Jewel and Jorn.
Hello, thank you for being here today. Hillsdale's been a big part of even our learning process. We were homeschooled, and we've gotten many piece of literature from Hillsdale and done all the amazing, done many of the amazing courses and information you guys present. So speaking about Congress, it's such a core part of the Constitution, the making of the American experiment. It's the democratic part. It's like the most democratic part of the federal government, where we the people are most heard. So I have a few questions / statements, and then you can just reply to them. So number one, Congress is not supposed to delegate their power. We've seen that at some point there was Supreme Court rulings, and the courts kind of moved to not challenge Congress very much on this. So we have large administrative organizations that are kind of vested in possibly the executive branch or other branches. I'm not exactly sure, but they seem to have a type of authority to almost legislate without legislation. So do you want to say anything about that?
Sure. No, that's a good question that really gets to the relationship of the legislative branch to both the executive and the bureaucracy. And I think what you're referencing is, especially for the last century or so, Congress has more and more passed vaguer regulations, vaguer laws that then delegate a lot of the particular decisions to agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency or Health and Human Services. And I think that's a very legitimate question, because it's asking, where does legislative power end and the power to execute or carry out laws begin? And that's been a struggle over the last several generations. And right now, it is true that a lot of our regulations are made by agencies. And one reason they do that is because government has gotten much larger. It does a lot more. And by the way, the people have voted for that. But Congress has had trouble keeping up. And the way they've tried to keep up is to delegate a lot of the actual decision making to other branches, to the executive, to the bureaucracy. And I think that it's legitimate to ask if that goes too far and undermines the role of Congress itself. Isn't Congress supposed to be making the laws because they're the connection to we the people? They're the ones that are held responsible by the people. So yeah, I think that's a very legitimate question, and it's been a difficulty that Congress has wrestled with and that the courts have wrestled with, trying to see what the lines are over the last several generations. So yeah, Congress does a lot less legislating and a lot more oversight of agencies now because they want to pass that buck a little bit for some of the reasons I was just mentioning. Also, it means they don't get blamed by their voters. They can pass it off. But again, I think if they're going to be the legislative branch, that's a question we have to ask if they're doing their job properly. And by the way, this has nothing to do with what they're doing. I mean, this has nothing to do with what the policies are. It's the question of who makes those policies.
And do you think that do you think that it's the Congress itself, that the impetus for this movement has come from Congress itself in self-interest of possibly, like you said, passing the buck a little, because then they can claim ownership for good things, but then they can distance themselves from things that are not popular? Or do you think that there's also a great pressure that's been exerted now by these large or departments that are set up, and possibly even from the executive branch as well? So do you think that those two things, do you think that they're equal? Do you think one is much more of a cause? Do you think that, what do you think about that? Or do you think there's another cause that I missed, that it's not, that it's less of the Congress itself and less of the pressures outside of Congress and a different thing?
I think that it's a little of both, but ultimately you're always going to have other parts of the government trying to gain more power. That's what Federalist 51 said, that ambition is going to fight within a branch to try to gain as much power for it as one can. So we shouldn't be surprised at that. What's more surprising is that Congress has been more willing to give up its power willingly, to delegate more and more of the decision-making to the other branches, which I think was less anticipated. And I think, again, that comes from one, there is sometimes an attempt to want to not take the blame. That's pretty natural. But I think the other thing is what I was saying earlier too, which is the size and scope of government. That as government has done more and more, it's hard to make laws. It's hard to get all of the House, a majority of the House and a majority of the Senate to agree on something. And as the responsibilities of government have expanded, the need for regulation has gotten much more. The need to make a lot more regulations have occurred, and Congress has struggled to keep up. And the way they've tried to keep up is to delegate some of that decision making to the bureaucracy. And so one question that you have is if you're going to say, okay, I want Congress to do more of the legislating, which a lot of people say, you know, whether they're on the left or the right, you know, because honestly, it's again, not about what policies you want, it's about who makes them. But then the question would be, well, what's the limit to how much Congress can do, and therefore how much government can do if it's going to do the legislation itself? So that's part of that question that has been a big part of modern government that maybe wasn't as much the case when government was doing a lot less, or the states were doing a lot more in the 19th and 18th centuries.
I have a kind of a double question here then. And it's about the powers that Congress is given in the article. So when you look at one of the controversial pieces, it would be like the Commerce Clause, saying that they have power over regulating commerce between the states. So obviously one big thing that it was established was that the states needed a certain amount of free trade between them for us to be like one sovereign nation. But besides that, what at the time of the Constitution, how was that understood, regulating the trade, interstate trade? How was that understood at that time? And why was it mostly because what I said? What else was included in that?
Yeah, I think this is related to what you said. The biggest reason that they wanted power over commerce between the states was to make us one nation commercially, to not make it as happened under the Articles of Confederation, where trying to do business in another state was almost like trying to do business in another country, and in a country that often was hostile to you, that wanted to prefer its own commerce to others. And that's going to create not just economic animosity between the different states, it's going to create political and social animosity. And they said, we don't want that. We want to be one country. We want to be political brothers and sisters. And one way to do that is to say, the rules of how we interact economically between ourselves, between the different states, is going to be run by a national government, regulated by a national Congress that is composed of all of us. And so therefore the rules can be more fair and applied to all of us. And so that's the big reason why they said we need the national government to be over interstate commerce, and then to leave the interstate commerce to the states. And why that's become such a big power, as I was saying before, think about how much of your lives involve some kind of commerce. The food you buy, the clothes you buy, going to college, buying insurance, buying a car, buying gas. So much of our lives involve some kind of that. So who regulates it, the national or the state government, becomes an important part. And what the national constitution was really trying to do with federalism is say, let's make what pertains to all of us be done by the national government, and what pertains to parts of us be done by the state governments. And that's, I think, nowhere clearer, at least in text, even though it's been debated in application, than in something like the Commerce Clause and its division between national and state government.
And that's something that makes so much sense when you think about, of course, that they would need that to be a commercial, like you said, a commercial nation, and not something where individuals, where it was like going to a different country to do business, going across state lines. But it certainly seems to have given a power, like in modern day, that goes well beyond that, or at least it's cited for them to be able to regulate very different things than sorry, I have to plug in my laptop 1 second. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you for holding on a second. Anyway, so good.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two things to think about the modern commerce power. One is we are much more national in our economy than we were in the 19th and 18th century. So what is interstate commerce has expanded dramatically, because you're not buying your chickens from the local market. You're buying it from 3 or 4 corporations that are across the whole country. So that's one way that the commerce power has become more powerful to the national government. The other is, in reaction to that, you do have the national government, and the courts have been acquiescent in this, expanding what it defines as part of interstate commerce. And probably the most extreme version of that was a case in the 1940s called Wickard v. Filburn, where a man growing wheat on his farm in Ohio and not selling it, just having it there to eat, was considered interstate commerce because it could somehow indirectly, by maybe 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, if anyone remembers that, affect commerce. I think that is the first is just natural. If you nationalize the economy, the national government is going to have more regulatory power. The other is a big source of debate, whether that was taking the Commerce Clause too far and how far you're going to go with that. So I think that the massive expanse of the Commerce Clause is really both. One, we have become more lenient in what we define as interstate commerce. Two, even by the old standards, interstate commerce has grown because of the nationalization of the economy, especially over the last century.
All right, thank you. It's definitely an interesting thing when you go back and read what's in the Constitution itself, and you see what the framework is for this nation. It definitely can be almost inspiring. It can also leave you wondering how certain things go on today, or how it got exactly to this point. So thank you for answering a bunch of those questions. I know Jordan's got some now that our laptop has power.
So I was kind of sparked by what Jules saying about the legislative branch passing decisions, and it made me think about what you said in Article 7, I believe, in Section 7, about how legislative branch has this powers, and then they're not all defined. All powers necessary to run. So, do you think that's where that overflow of powers came from, and their ability to pass it? And do you think that there ever should have been a point now, since it was written, that we should have defined those powers more, the limit of the powers more.
Right. And I think you're making reference to the necessary and proper clause, right? That in addition to the listed powers, Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out those. And here you have the tension between that comes out, and again, I'm going to reference Federalist 51, where it says, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. If government were run by angels, you wouldn't need any limits on government. What that means is that government is going to be an imperfect solution to our imperfections, meaning it needs power and it needs limitations on the power. And what they ran into under the Articles of Confederation was the fact that you can't always anticipate what government needs to do to accomplish its goals. So what they tried to do was have limited ends. Only the powers herein granted can be pursued. But then what they left undefined was not the purposes. The purposes are listed in Article 1, Section 8 prior to the necessary and proper clause. What they left undefined was how do you do it? And what they were trying to do is say, we're going to try to give government the power to be able to accomplish its goals when we don't know every emergency that may come up, every circumstance that may arise. And the idea was, by listing limited ends, we're going to limit government. By having unlisted means, we're going to give power to do those limited ends. And I think that's, the question about that is, how well did they do that? I think pretty well, but you still are going to have questions about whether they went too far. Certainly, there were debates about what does necessary and proper mean. Hamilton and Jefferson sparred over that in Washington's first cabinet. But I think that's why. And if you want to say whether that's the real source of too much expansive government power, if you think they've gone too far, that's if you think so. I mean, I think your brother's question was actually partially disproves that, because he was worried about the Commerce Clause, which is a listed power, not the necessary and proper clause. So I think the problem there is just, we are a government and a people that try to be governed by words. Words, meaning the rule of law, is actually going to dictate how we act. And guess what? Words can be imprecise. We can misinterpret them. And I think rather than throw up our hands and say that means we should just do whatever we want, we should just redouble our efforts to say, how do we submit ourselves to this document, submit ourselves to those government powers, understand them better, and therefore maintain the rule of law, even though it might be not absolutely perfect. I would argue that in human history, the alternative of just letting a ruler do what he wants is much more arbitrary, is much less restraining, is much more of a problem for justice and truth than the problems you're going to run into with human imperfections of language.
Okay, so just to really further that, I guess, so you think Article 1 is good where it is, and it's just really the people that have to interpret it correctly for it to be a best form?
I mean, we could debate maybe particular provisions or things like that, but I think that in general, the division of power it does between state and national governments and the listing of powers that it gives, if we take seriously the list and don't try to read in things that aren't there, if we take seriously that the necessary and proper clause is what it says it is, not a way of shoehorning in whatever you want, but trying to say, what do we need, what's proper to carry out these listed powers, that it was written with enough clarity that we can, not that we won't make mistakes, but that we can have a good idea of where the lines are and what to do. And by the way, when you list these powers, there's tons of things that are left for us to decide what to do. So one thing to not confuse is that something can be smart and unconstitutional. It can be dumb and constitutional. And part of we, the people, having this power through our representatives in Congress is the power, once these things are listed, to pursue what we think is just and right. And that's not a constitutional question. That's a question of what we think is good policy under the Constitution. That's a confusion I think people sometimes make. Just because you disagree with a policy doesn't make it unconstitutional. And I think that's something that sometimes makes people doubt the Constitution more than they should. They should be blaming people who are making bad decisions under the Constitution, or praising good decisions rather than blaming the Constitution itself. It leaves us room to govern ourselves.
Thank you. I always love hearing different thinkers' ideas about the Constitution. So thank you for humoring.
I'll ask one more, and then whoever else is around the horn can start. But I guess in closing, one more thing one more way, I guess, one more branch of the government almost could be said is like the states. It's like the federal government. You have the three branches of government, and then you also have the states. Do you think that the states were meant to be that last check in the checks and balance of like that if the judicial branch didn't strike down something Congress did, like let's say we're talking specifically about power in the EPA, that the founders would have seen that the state would have invalidated the regulation, and that's would have been where that if the court didn't do it, then the states would have done it. Or was it that or is it more kind of what you just said earlier, which was that if we the people allow the thing, no matter what's written, we're going to allow it anyway. I don't know if that's the best way to say it, but.
Well, I think there's two questions there, and I'll take the second one that I think you said at the very end first. Obviously, we say the Constitution rules and that we rule through the Constitution. That's what I think is just and right. Of course, sometimes power can overwhelm justice, not because it should, but because it can. And I think the Constitution is only as followed as we are willing to follow it. So we must, every generation and every time we act politically, submit ourselves to that document, believing that it is wise and worthwhile to operate within it. So yes, I mean, you could have the people just utterly ignore the Constitution, and I think that wouldn't be following our form of government, but it's certainly possible, just like a tyrant coming in could do what he wants, right? But your other question about the states is, I think, yes, the states, maybe I wouldn't say are a fourth branch of government. I think there's a difference between separation of powers, which has to do with the kind of power used, lawmaking, law executing, law adjudicating, versus federalism, which is to take the entire power of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, and split it between two levels. But that itself is a limitation. It's a limitation, meaning all power doesn't accrue in one level of government, and that does leave the states some ways and means to make sure the national government doesn't overextend itself. It also leaves the national government a way to make sure the states don't themselves oppress the people within their states. So I think what you have there are two distinct ways of accomplishing the same goal, which is dividing power so that power doesn't overwhelm, and dividing power so the entity that is best equipped to exercise that power has it. And so that's why you want a little bit of cooperation between the national states governments, and you also want a little bit of competition between them. And I'd say one power that has undermined that a little bit is the spending clause. In Article 1, Section 8, I didn't mention this, but the national government is given the power to spend money. And one thing it has sometimes done is offered the states and said, well, we, the national government, can't do X, but states, if you'll do it, we'll give you money to do so. And to some extent, I don't think that's wrong, that the national government has a power to do that. At the same time, I think wanting to make sure that the states and the national government keep a healthy competition is essential to making sure that things run the way they're supposed to. You want cooperation and competition at the same time.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Jewel and Jorn. Aubrey, did we lose Haley?
Yeah, I'm contacting her now.
Okay, well, I'm going to pop into some audience questions real quick while we're waiting for Haley. And I know, and Haley's got some great questions, I know. she sent me a few of them, and I can certainly read them, but I'd love to have Haley on if we can to ask them. So, Professor Carrington, first of all, Mohammed Sarmed Atta asks if you could talk a little bit more about Article 1, Section 5. And I had my Constituting America Constitution here, and I looked up Article 1, Section 5, and it looks to me like it lays out some very basic rules for both the House and the Senate as far as keeping a journal of its proceedings and talking about basically that it sounds like to me that it's saying that the House and Senate have the authority to set their own rules. And it talks a little bit about when they should adjourn. And I think they've probably passed rules since then that elaborate on that a little bit more. But could you talk a little bit about Article 1, Section 5?
Right. And you're right that one thing, when I said that the Constitution leaves a lot unsaid or a lot to we the people, it also leaves a lot unsaid and a lot to we the people's representatives. And so what you have in Section 5, especially, I think an important part is it opens by saying each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members. So one thing we have is a lot of power to run its own business, to set up what officers it's going to have, to judge who was rightly elected to it, and to also expel members. So we've seen in the last few years a lot about the impeachment power, and Congress is the one that does the impeaching. The House tries, or the House accuses, and the Senate convicts. There is no impeachment for congressmen. It's actually a decision made by Congress itself whether to expel and what would be the criteria that would make you ineligible or unfit to be a member of Congress. And I think finally, yeah, I'll mention the Journal of Proceedings. The reason they also recognize that since we, the people, are the ultimate sovereign legislative power and we're delegating it to Congress, that their proceedings should be made public, should be published so that we can assess whether they're operating the way that we think they should. And so I think that those are the main points that are trying again to let Congress run its own business, and to do so in a way that I think trusts that we, the people, are going to select members that are that we think are going to do well. In some ways, some of the questions we were answering earlier about limitations on power, at some point you have to trust that power will not always and totally be corrupt. You have to let government actually operate. And I think that Section 5 is one example of the framers doing that with the Constitution.
Well, thank you. And John Brescia says, Congress seems largely broken. It cannot even produce budget bills on time, especially in light of the West Virginia versus EPA and CA5 SEC rulings this year. We need a functional Congress more than ever. What changes would you recommend?
Oh, there was a book that had a wonderful title about Congress. It was called The Broken Branch. And by the way, we're written, people across the aisle agreed that whoever is in control of Congress, it's struggling to actually do its job. And I think a couple things could make Congress better at its job. One is the congressmen often have two loyalties. One is loyalty to their institution, being a member of the House or Senate. The other is loyalty to their party, their political party. And I would argue that the power of the institution and the loyalty to the institution has decreased too much, and loyalty to the party is too high. Now, I think you need both, but it's too high. And therefore, you don't have Congress being proud of being Congress. You have Congress being proud of being a Republican or Democrat. And so how do you fix that? I think you need to strengthen the committee structure. I was mentioning that there's a committee structure. I think the committees need to be more powerful. I think they need to have more responsibility for writing bills. Too many bills are written by party leadership and then kind of rushed to the floor with people unable to read them. So doing that process, I think, matters, and returning to a kind of regular order where you're having regular debate, where you're having a regular process that used to be the norm. I think that would be a major part. And I think possibly reorganizing Congress where can you bring the bureaucracy in underneath it rather than delegating after the lawmaking has occurred? Can you have bureaucrats helping with drafting legislation? Can you have bureaucrats helping with thinking about the regulations, but still making Congress debate and pass them? Is that a way to kind of have a compromise between the way the Constitution says Congress should be passing laws and the fact that the regulatory regime we have now, as I said before, has outpaced Congress's normal ability to legislate? So those would be some. I think the parties need to go down a little bit. The institutional loyalty needs to go up. And I think that you need to see how can we make Congress legislate more, even accounting for the greater regulatory requirements that exist now.
Well, thank you. And I noticed we've got a Capitol Hill veteran in our audience today, Dave Hoppy, who directed both the House and the Senate whip offices and led the Senate Majority Leader's office in both the Clinton and Bush administrations. And I'm sure Dave might have some comments too, Dave, if you want to add them, or we'd love to have you on sometime to talk about this further. I do think that we lost Haley again. But I wanted, let's see, Nan Nickel says the progressive movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s and beyond wanted the government run by agencies because they could select, because I guess their thinking was, the progressive movement at the time was, they could select better educated people to make laws. And Nan asked, does a formal education make people more moral? That's what the progressives seem to believe. Do you want to comment on the progressive movement during that time period?
Sure. What the progressive movement ultimately said was that separation of powers was wrong. That was a mistake. You know, not that the founders made mistakes on everything, but that the separation of powers doesn't really work. And they had a new separation, and that was between politics and administration. And the idea was that we can have we the people make broad, sometimes vague laws that say things like we want clean air, safe streets, et cetera. But what they said was, while we've been good at articulating what we want to do under separation of powers, we've been bad at making it happen. And as government has gotten more complicated, as the world has gotten more complicated, a bigger economy, big business, big corporations, we don't have the luxury of not being effective at carrying out our will. And so therefore, what we need is we need to stop hiring people to carry out the laws based on whether the people are voting for them. And we need to start hiring them based on their expertise in the area they'd be carrying out, expertise in energy, expertise in say transportation, and that will make government more effective, and it will modernize it in a way that they wanted. And what she was saying about, I think, morality is true too. They said politics is what is corrupting us, and if we have these administrators that are outside the political process, they will lose the corruption that politics has caused in the way our government operates. And, you know, none of that seems illogical, by the way. And I think our government now partly operates that way, partly operates the old way. I do think one thing the American founders might say to that is it really the fact that politics corrupts us, or do we have a little bit of corruption ourselves that politics has to deal with? And if you remove part of the government from the political process, are you leaving the corruption, even unintentionally or well-meaning, and not having a check on it the way we have with elections and electors in the old system. And is the separation of powers system maybe more effective than previously thought? Is it the fact that separation of powers merely restrains government, or does separation of powers, I think the American founders would say, actually is like an assembly line that makes government more effective? It says we're going to have a branch that's good at lawmaking, it should make laws. We're going to have an executive agency that's good at executing laws, let it do its job, rather than with the bureaucracy that sometimes is writing laws, executing them, and carrying them out all at the same time. So I think there's arguments both ways, but I think that's the debate that's going on, that the progressives engage with the American founding. I think it's a little bit of how the American founders would respond to that question. And now we have a government that does a little bit of both, actually, based on the way it's set up.
Well, thank you. Now, I do have one of Haley's questions here. Haley says, please explain the power of Congress regarding granting letters of marque. What are they exactly?
Yeah, marquee and reprisal.
Reprisal.
Yeah, you're just pointing out that it's not one we're real familiar with. So power letters of marquee and reprisal have to do with war, and the power to grant someone, for example, safe passage if they're coming as an ambassador from a power that we're at war with. So it's really an extension of the war power for how we conduct those kind of diplomatic relations. Otherwise, what you could have happen is an ambassador from another country comes and says something we don't like, and we kill him, and that destroys and what that's meant to do is facilitate to some degree how can we discuss peace even in the midst of war, and to mitigate how terrible war can be between different countries, or tense relations as well.
Great. Now, I've got one other question from Haley. Haley says, can you explain what is a uniform rule of naturalization, and if you think our laws of naturalization are working today?
So naturalization is making those who are not citizens, especially who have immigrated, citizens. To naturalize means to make them citizens. And Congress is supposed to be the one that makes that decision. They want it to be uniform. I think that's partly because they want a national conception of citizenship, a national conception of what it means to be an American. I think that the way the system operates now, obviously illegal immigration is a huge debate, but that's not what we're really talking about with this. This is the question of what decisions do we make about who to legally make citizens. And I think that I think to the degree that's not working, it's more because of our inability to talk with each other about what it means to be an American, what it means to be a citizen, and to ask legitimate questions that balance two things. One, we're a country based on the idea that all men are created equal, and that stretches across all boundaries of nationality, of internationality. But the other is we are our own country, and as our own country, we may have higher responsibilities to those who are here just because that's where our laws operate, because that's where our Constitution operates. And so I think balancing that universality of all men are created equal, the particularity of we are our own country, you have some people that tend toward the universality, you have some that tend toward the particularity. And I think our inability to come to a consensus on immigration policy has been because we haven't been able to find that middle ground that tries to respect both, that I think the Constitution itself respects.
Thank you. Great question. And then John Chambers in our audience asks, and I think this gets back to reforms of Congress to make Congress more effective. He asks, how about increase the number of representatives, say 1 to every 100,000 instead of the current 1 per 750,000, capped at 435 by Congress in 1910?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And it was debated even at the founding, how many representatives do you have? And this is another where you're trying to find a sweet middle. If you have too few representatives, then it won't be very representative, because it won't be an actual slice of the people. It'll be a slice of the people, and therefore not truly an exercise of we the people sovereignty. On the other hand, remember I said it in the opening, that was the goal of Congress, to deliberate well so it will legislate well. And if you were to have a Congress that is 5,000 members or 10,000 members, how well can they deliberate when it's that large? And so one of the difficulties of having a country that is now swelled from 3 million at the American founding to 340, 350 million now is, can you maintain that balance? How well? So how can you have enough representatives that it's a slice of the American people? Can you have few enough that they can still talk to each other? And so that's the question about, if we were to expand Congress, it might make it more representative. Would it turn it into a kind of Tower of Babel where people are talking past each other and having trouble actually legislating well, which, by the way, would make Congress weaker, not stronger? And so that's a question that has been with us since the beginning, and I think only becomes a more acute question the larger the country gets.
Great. And the last one, I think we've got time for one more here. Linda from Colorado asks about general welfare, and I'm not sure that's in Article 1. Is that may be just in the preamble, but she asked, what do you think the founders meant by promoting the general welfare? And then she also asks an add-on question: any chance of a balanced budget ever being passed?
Well, it's happened in my lifetime. But before I get to that, there is a general welfare clause in Article 1, Section 8, which says that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's also in the preamble. You're right that it's also in the preamble as a general goal. And I think where that clause has been misinterpreted is as if it's merely the power to regulate for the general welfare, full stop. If that was the case, then I think all the rest of Article 1, Section 8 would be superfluous, because isn't everything supposed to be for the general welfare in accordance with the preamble? So I think the better way to understand that, if you go back and look at the text, is it's the power to tax and spend for the general welfare. And that general welfare is then defined by the rest of the article. So it's really just saying you should be able to raise and collect and spend money for what? For the general welfare. How do we understand the general welfare of the clause, that section as a whole? So people who try to point it, read it the other way, I think, you don't want to read a document to make the rest of the document not matter. And so I think that would be the mistake. So I think that's the way you should read it. Will we ever pass a balanced budget? Like I said, we did for a couple years there at the end of the Clinton administration. And I think that came from a combination of great economic growth and some fiscal tightening. I think we will balance the budget when the American people really want it and vote for it. And I think that goes back to the fact that we, the people, are sovereign. And I think it goes back to two, don't always be fooled by what people want in the abstract versus what they want in the concrete. We have a lot of times people will say, do you want a balanced budget? Yes. Okay, do you want to balance the budget by trimming spending on X? Well, no, not that. Or trimming spending on Y. Well, no, that we can't touch that. And I think in general, the American people have had unbalanced budgets because they have not wanted to make it a priority over the things they actually want to spend money on, which is their right. Now, we'll have the question, will that ever come back to haunt us or not? That's another thing where if it's a foolish thing we're doing by not balancing the budget, the U.S. Constitution generally, I think, leaves us that ability because we have the ability to borrow money. Congress has the ability to borrow money. Again, the Constitution is not foolproof, even if it has a lot of wisdom itself. It leaves a lot to we the people to make those decisions.
Well, I love how we came back full circle to right where we started with we the people, and you're exactly right. I agree that I think when we the people decide we want a balanced budget, we will get a balanced budget. Well, we would just want to thank you so much for your time and all of your great thoughts on Article 1. It was so enlightening and educational. And we encourage everyone who's watching to watch our entire series. And for anyone who watches our entire series, you're going to get a certificate, a downloadable certificate of constitutional knowledge from our Countdown to Constitution Day series. So you can watch them either online or watch them live. And we love having you all with us. I want to give one other shout out to Nicholas Henniger, who I see is on in our audience today, our best STEM winner. He was just on our winter trip a couple of weeks ago in Washington, D.C. And we love having our contest winners in our audience. So hi, Nick. Thanks for joining us. And thank you to all in the audience who make what we do possible. And again, Professor Carrington, thank you. And thank you for all the great work that Hillsdale does. Hillsdale is just such a wonderful institution. We have several former contest winners, one of which is currently a student at Hillsdale. And y'all are just so supportive to our efforts in so many ways. So we thank you. And thank you for your time.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for the great questions. And I really do think we're all partners in trying to educate ourselves as human beings and citizens to perpetuate this great republic. And because we the people do rule, these kind of things that we're doing right now are essential because you know, an educated public is a free public, and we hope to maintain that. And I think you all are doing great work toward that end. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.